The sun was just climbing over the mesa when a challenge rolled across Dry Creek Valley like thunder before a storm. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Word tore through the sagebrush faster than wildfire. A widow with fire in her gaze and steel in her voice had thrown down a gauntlet meant to split the true cowboys from the pretenders, the men from the boys. Her name was Sadie McCoy, and she owned the finest horseflesh this side of the Rio Grande. A black stallion called Steelheart, 17 hands tall, eyes like bright burning coal, spirit unbroken by man. Not by the 25, who had already tried, not by the smooth-talking breakers who had ridden in from Kansas City with their ropes, their swagger, and their pride wounded on the way out. But Sadie wasn't after just any rider. She was hunting for a real cowboy, the kind her late husband Hank McCoy had been, before sickness laid him in the ground 3 winters back. The kind who knew that winning a horse's respect wasn't the same as crushing its will. The kind who understood some things in this world could never be conquered, only partnered with. So she made her stand at the general store one Tuesday morning when the whole town was there to hear. If you're a true cowboy, prove it on my stallion. Ride him for 10 minutes without getting thrown, and I'll pay you 50 in gold. But if you fail, don't come back to my place pretending you're something you're not. $50 was more than most men pocketed in half a year. Enough for land, enough to start over, enough to make fools think glory came easy. And they came chasing it. First, the local boys raised on mule-back rides to church, mistaking that for horsemanship. Then the drifters' sun-creased faces, tobacco-stained grins, full of tall tales and cheap courage. Finally, the professionals, the rodeo hands and horsemen who carried their reputations in their strut and their limp on the way out. Every one of them thought he had the secret. Some swung whips trying to frighten Steelheart into surrender. Others offered sugar cubes and soft words, hoping to sweet-talk their way onto his back. A few dragged contraptions of straps and pulleys, thinking force would win what no man had earned. But Steelheart had his own laws. The first rider lasted 8 seconds. The stallion rose like a dark spirit clawing at the sky, then snapped sideways and flung the man into the corral fence. The second held on for 15 seconds, before Steelheart, precise as a saw blade, launched him clear. The third, fourth, and fifth learned the hard truth that pride walks ahead of a fall, and sometimes the fall leaves hoofprints. By the end of that first week, Doc Harlan had patched more cracked ribs and battered egos than during the last wild cattle drive. Still, they lined up. The tale spread beyond Dry Creek. Cowboys rode in from other counties, drawn by gold and legend, like moths to a lantern bound to burn them. Sadie McCoy watched from her porch, arms crossed, face carved from stone. Some whispered she was cruel, watching men fail for sport. Others muttered she tempted fate, that no horse was worth men's bones. But Sadie knew what they didn't. She'd seen her husband ride Steelheart. Once. The day before Hank died, fever burning him alive, he had walked out to the corral, and somehow, that stallion let him mount. For 10 minutes, horse and man moved as one, like music no one else could hear. When Hank finally stepped down, his eyes shone brighter than fever alone. "That horse knows things, Sadie," he'd whispered. "He's waiting for the right man, someone who understands what it means to be free." Now, 3 years gone, she was still waiting. The 15th challenger rode in on a Thursday. Jesse Pike, young, maybe 22, hair sun-bleached cocky, with the kind of confidence that hadn't yet been humbled. He clung for 12 seconds before Steelheart invented a new trick, dumping him face first in the water trough. Jesse stormed out of town, cursing never to return. The 20th challenger was a different breed. Virgil Tate, older quiet scars on his hands telling of honest work. He spent an hour standing by the fence letting Steelheart measure him. When he finally climbed in, the air held its breath. He lasted nearly 4 minutes before the Stallion reminded everyone that patience and partnership weren't the same thing. By the time the 25th man, Clyde Mercer, limped from the McCoy Ranch defeat, draped over him like a wet coat, the whole county was buzzing. Some swore Sadie's challenge was impossible. Others claimed Steelheart was touched by the devil. A few, like Old Man Boone, allowed that maybe the right cowboy just hadn't come along yet. But Sadie kept waiting, because she had seen what was possible. She had seen her husband and that Stallion moving like one soul split in two, and she knew that kind of bond couldn't be forced. Bought or beaten into being. It had to be earned. It had to be real. Somewhere out there, she believed was the man who understood. Miles away, in a weather-worn line shack smelling of coffee grounds and old leather, a man named Boon Laramie sat by a fading fire, listening to the wind whistle stories through the cracks. He'd heard the rumors drift down the cattle trails like tumbleweeds about the black stallion no one could ride, and the widow's challenge that had broken more men than a hard winter. Boone had been alone so long, solitude felt like kin. He worked the far range for the Double Bar brand checking fences, tending sick cattle, seeing people maybe once a month when he rode in for supplies. It was honest work, decent pay, the sort that suited a man who'd learned people could wound you in ways no steer ever would. Something about those tales gnawed at Boon Laramie. It wasn't the promise of $50, though. That kind of money could buy enough beans and bacon to last a season. It wasn't even the dare itself, though. He'd sat plenty of tough horses in his time. It was something deeper, something that crept in during the half-sleep hours, when a man's guard dropped and truth slipped through like dawn through a cracked shutter. Maybe it was the way folks told the story, not like a contest with a prize, but like a trial a man had to pass. Not a horse to be broken, but a bond to be earned. Or maybe it was because Boone had spent so many years running from ghosts, he'd forgotten how it felt to ride toward something instead. Once he'd been another man, before war had hollowed him, before he saw what men could do when they lost all sense of mercy, before he'd learned that survival sometimes meant not caring about anything past your next breath. But horses were different. They didn't lie, didn't betray, didn't leave you bleeding in a ditch because of politics or grudges. Horses told the truth, whether it was in their fear or their trust, their fury or their affection. And if a man listened close, he might learn more than he expected. The fire snapped sparks, climbing the chimney like prayers. Boone pulled his coat tighter and came to a decision that shifted the course of his life. Come morning, he'd saddle his bay and ride for Dry Creek Valley. Not for gold, not for bragging rights, but because sometimes a man needed to find out what he was made of, even if the finding broke him. Especially if it broke him. And Boon Laramie already suspected he'd been broken a long time. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to see if the pieces could fit together again. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shack windows like restless spirits. Inside, a lonely cowboy closed his eyes and dreamed of black stallions and second chances, not knowing that tomorrow would set him on the ride that would mark his life forever. Morning hit cold and sharp as cut glass. Boone saddled his bay gelding Copper in the dim gray, before sunrise, his hands moving through the motions, while doubts crowded his mind like shadows. He packed light coffee hardtack, a bedroll tied behind the cantle, and a quiet resolve born from a man done running from himself. The trail to Dry Creek changed with every mile. Rolling grass gave way to broken mesas, then dropped into valleys where cottonwoods hugged dry creek beds, like old friends with secrets. Copper stepped sure-footed, ears twitching, as if he knew which rocks would hold and which would give way. By noon, the chill was gone, and Boon could see the valley open up below him like a land of promise or damnation, depending on what a man carried inside. Smoke curled from chimneys in the distance. Fences cut patterns across the land, each post driven with sweat and purpose. But it was the sound that caught him first. Thunder trapped in too small a space fury, given hooves and muscle. Even half a mile out, Boon could hear Steelheart's defiance echoing off the valley walls, a wild song about freedom no poet could match. Copper's ears pricked, and Boon felt something stir in his chest. Not excitement exactly, but recognition. Like one untamed soul calling to another. The McCoy Ranch lay in a natural bowl where spring water gathered and grass stayed thick even in lean years. Every fence and every building spoke of labor and foresight. But Boone's eyes went straight to the corral. A crowd ringed it like witnesses at a hanging. He dismounted, led Copper to the hitching rail by the barn, and stepped toward the gathering. The faces were a mix you'd see at any Western spectacle. Dry Creek folks of all kinds, ranch hands, townsmen with soft palms and hard mouths, drifters chasing excitement like strays after scraps. All eyes were fixed on a man strutting into the corral. Rafe Hollis. Fancy chaps, silver spurs, walking like he'd never met a horse he couldn't master. And in the center stood Steelheart black as midnight water, a storm made flesh. His neck arched with pride, unbroken, his every move charged with lightning. Boone realized this wasn't just an animal. This was a force of nature wearing a hide and a heartbeat. Rafe carried a rope confidence dripping off him like summer sweat. He clearly thought he knew every trick, his reputation trailing him like dust before a storm. The Dry Creek folks muttered their approval as Rafe Hollis spun his rope, forming a loop with the ease of a showman. But Steelheart had seen ropes before. The moment that noose brushed his neck, the stallion exploded. He rose high on his hind legs, front hooves tearing at the sky as if he aimed to drag heaven down, then crashed to earth with such force the ground itself seemed to quake. In a blur of muscle and fury, Steelheart twisted sideways using raw strength and perfect timing to open a gap the cowboy never saw coming. Rafe hit the dust hard enough to rattle his lungs and strip the swagger from his step. He rolled away from those pounding hooves, coughing, coated in dirt, and for a breath it looked like he might have sense enough to stay down. But pride makes fools of men who should know better. Rafe snatched for the rope again. Steelheart's patience ended right there. What followed wasn't just bucking, it was artistry in destruction. The stallion turned and reared, twisted and lunged, every move learned from years of casting off men who tried to take what only trust could give. Rafe managed half a minute before Steelheart sealed his fate. A final bone-jarring kick sent him sailing into the fence, the rails groaning under the impact. He landed in a crumple of fancy leather, and bruised pride crawling toward escape like a man trying to recall which way was up. The Dry Creek folks began to scatter, shaking their heads, muttering about a devil horse and foolish challenges. And that's when Boon Laramie truly saw her for the first time. Sadie McCoy stood on her porch like a queen holding court with the open sky. She wasn't the kind of beauty that stopped saloons cold, but there was a weight about her, a gravity that made a man forget to look away. Her hair, autumn copper, was tied back to frame a face carved by storms that hadn't broken her. Her dress was plain built for work, not for show, but it fit her the way good leather molds to a working man's hands. Her eyes caught him, and held him still. Winter gray with threads of blue deep enough a man could drown before reaching the bottom. They were the eyes of someone who had loved, lost, and rebuilt herself from the ashes. Eyes that had stripped the masks off 25 men before him and found them wanting. Now they fixed on Boon with a force that laid him bare as if she could see straight through the armor he'd spent years forging. "You here to try your luck with my horse?" she called, her voice clear as a bell across the yard. Boon touched the brim of his hat, an instinct older than manners. "Thinking about it, ma'am." She studied him, taking in the wear of his gear, the way he moved near horses like he belonged in their world. The quiet steadiness that comes from real work, not empty boasting. "What makes you different from the rest?" Boon weighed it. He wasn't stronger than some, wasn't richer or more connected. He had no reputation to ride in, on no tricks to set him apart. And maybe that was the answer. "Can't say I am different, ma'am," he said at last. "But I'm not here to prove anything to you, to that crowd, not even to myself. I just want to see if that horse and I can find some common ground." Something softened in Sadie's face at his words. She stepped off the porch with the sure grace of a woman who wasted no motion, and Boon caught the faint scent of lavender soap and honest labor. "What's your name?" "Cowboy Boon Laramie, ma'am. Worked the line shacks for the double bar up north. Sadie McCoy." She offered her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from years of real toil. Boon was caught off guard by the strength in it. "You ever been married, Boon Laramie?" The question struck him like a hammer, not for its boldness, but for how it cornered him. "No, ma'am. Came close once, before the war. After that." He let the words fall away, hoping she'd hear the silence as much as what he said. She nodded as though she'd expected it. "My husband was the only man who ever rode that horse." You know why Boon looked at Steelheart pacing the corral like bottled lightning, guessing it's because he never tried to break him. "That's part of it," Sadie said, approval threading her tone. "But it's more than that. He knew some things are worth partnering with, not owning. Real strength's knowing when to yield and when to stand firm. Trust isn't taken, it's earned." Boon realized she wasn't just talking about horses. She was talking about the kind of man her husband had been. The kind of man she was waiting for, the kind who understood that some trials weren't meant to be conquered, but transcended. "The rules are simple," Sadie continued. "Stay on Steelheart's back 10 minutes without hitting dirt, and the 50's yours. But if he throws you, you leave and don't come back." And Boon Laramie. "Yes, ma'am, don't set foot in that corral unless you're sure. Because once you climb over that fence, there's no walking back to who you were before." Boon looked from the corral back to Sadie, and something clicked inside him like a lock finally finding its key. "Ma'am, I haven't been sure about much in a long time," he said quietly. "But I'm sure about this." Sadie studied his face a moment longer. Sadie gave a single nod. "Then get to know him first. Most men just vault that fence like they're saddling a church pony. Steelheart don't take kindly to that kind of arrogance." Boon Laramie walked slow toward the corral, his boots crunching softly on packed dirt. The last of the Dry Creek folks leaned closer, sensing this cowboy might not be cut from the same cloth as the others, though Boon hardly noticed them. His eyes stayed locked on the stallion, those diamond black eyes sharp, wary, and proud. "Easy now, partner," Boon murmured, his voice pitched only for the horse. He didn't climb the fence. He leaned against the rails instead, waiting, letting Steelheart measure him the same way he was studying the stallion. Steelheart stepped forward with the cautious curiosity of something wild, burned too many times by men, but not ready to give up on the chance there might be better. He stopped 10 feet off, nostrils wide, as he caught Boon's scent, ears flicking forward and back, weighing signals most men never learned to send. "You've had your fill of fools, haven't you?" Boon whispered. "Men thinking they can take what you never offered, but that ain't what this is." Steelheart edged closer, Boon stayed still, hands quiet, offering nothing but presence. Time stretched long, measured in heartbeats, and the ripple of muscle under black hide. "My husband used to talk to him just like that," Sadie McCoy said softly from the fence. Said horses can hear the truth in a man's voice, even when the man's forgotten what truth sounds like. Boon tipped his head slightly, but never looked away from Steelheart. "What was your husband before sickness took him? Hank McCoy was the best horseman in 3 counties, but he never broke a horse, if you know my meaning. He showed them what they could become, instead of forcing them to be something they weren't." Her voice carried the weight of love and loss. He said the finest horses choose their riders as much as riders choose them. By now, Steelheart was close enough Boon could see the scars lacing his neck and shoulders marks left by men who had tried to conquer by force. But behind those dark eyes was something else. Not just fire. Recognition. Possibility. "He's been waiting," Boon said quietly. 3 years, Sadie answered. 3 years of men thinking whips or bribes or tricks could win him. 3 years of him showing the difference between submission and partnership. Boon finally moved just his hand palm up along the top rail. Steelheart's ears flicked forward, and after a breath that seemed eternal, he stepped close enough to blow warm breath across Boon's fingers. Not touching, but close enough to prove the door was open. "You ready for this?" Sadie asked. Boon looked over his shoulder and saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Hope, fragile, but alive. "Ma'am, I reckon I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know for what until right now." He climbed the fence, slow, deliberate, giving Steelheart every chance to shy away. But the stallion held steady, watching him, with the eyes of something that had learned to read a man's soul by what he did not, what he said. Inside the corral, it felt different, bigger, yet more intimate. Just Boon and Steelheart now with Sadie and the stragglers fading into distant thunder. Steelheart moved like liquid shadow circling Boon close enough to test far enough to keep judgment. Boon matched his rhythm without crowding him. "You know what they say about you." Boon spoke calm, steady. "They say you can't be ridden, that the devil himself runs in your veins, that you're too proud, too wild, too stubborn for any man alive." Steelheart snorted a sound that might have been laughter or contempt, but I don't buy that. Boon went on, voice low. "I think you're just tired of men wanting to own you instead of know you, tired of being treated like a problem instead of a partner." The stallion's ears pricked forward, his circling, slowing, not stopping, but listening. "I'm not here to break you," Boon said. "I'm here because maybe both of us have carried heavy loads long enough. Maybe it's time we set them down." Steelheart made another round, then another, each pass pulling him closer to Boon. The sun lit the black sheen of his hide, revealing depth and fire that set him apart from ordinary stock. "My husband told me once," Sadie called her voice clear in the stillness, "the best horses don't need breaking at all. They were never truly wild. They were just waiting for someone who spoke their language." Boon nodded, eyes never leaving Steelheart. The stallion stood now 15 feet away, head-high ears, keen body, coiled with possibility. Boon felt the truth settle deep in his chest. This was the moment, not about force, not about grit, but about the only thing that mattered, trust. "You want the truth," Boon said, his voice steady. His words came out no louder than a prayer, yet carried across the corral. "I'm scared not of you, but of what happens if this goes wrong. I've been hollow so long I forgot what it felt like to want something real. And you're as real as it gets." Steelheart stepped forward, then again. Each move deliberate, like a judge delivering a verdict that surprised even himself. "That's it." Boon. Laramie breathed. "That's the way. No force, no rush, just 2 battered souls searching for common ground in a world that had nearly forgotten gentleness. Steelheart drew near enough for Boon to see his own reflection in those dark, bottomless eyes. They stood locked together, man and horse measuring each other in silence, nothing to do with strength or skill or pride. Then, slow as sunrise, Boon raised his hand and laid his palm against Steelheart's neck. The stallion didn't shy, didn't strike, didn't unleash the violent refusals that had sent so many men to the dirt. Instead, he leaned into Boon's touch, slight but sure. It was enough. Enough to say that after years of mistrust, bruises, and broken tries, maybe it was time to believe again. Maybe it was time to remember what partnership could look like. The Dry Creek folks went still breath caught in their throats. Even Sadie McCoy looked frozen, her chest rising slow as though afraid to breathe. Boon's hand traced along Steelheart's neck and shoulder, learning the shape of strength wrapped in muscle and scars, listening to the language only a horse like this could speak. "Well, I'll be damned," someone muttered at the rail, but Boon barely heard. His world narrowed to this moment, this horse, this chance, fragile as mist, yet full of promise. "You ready?" he asked, though the words were more for himself than the stallion. Steelheart answered not with sound, but by letting his muscles soften just enough to show acceptance without surrender. Boon stepped to his left side, never breaking contact, every move slow and plain, giving the stallion room to back away if he chose. But Steelheart held steady, his breath deep and even, studying this man who asked, instead of demanded, who whispered, instead of shouted. It took near 10 minutes before Boon even thought about mounting. Not out of fear, but out of respect. This wasn't about getting on a horse, it was about stepping into a covenant built heartbeat by heartbeat. He gathered the rope halter he'd rigged for reins, set his left boot in the stirrup fashioned from braided leather. Steelheart's ears twitched back, then forward again, listening, weighing. He could have blown apart at any second, sent Boon skyward before he ever settled in the seat, but he didn't. He waited as though he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. When Boon eased his weight across that broad back, the world seemed to freeze. Steelheart stood still 1 beat, 2, 3. Then, smoother than silk sliding over skin, the stallion took a step forward. "Sweet mercy," someone whispered at the fence. Boon's universe shrank to the space between Steelheart's ears, the rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, the power under him like bottled lightning learning to dance. They started at a walk, circling the corral, slow testing balance together. Steelheart's gait was unlike any mount Boon had known, neither the jolting hop of a green horse nor the mechanical step of a trained one. It felt alive, fluid, like catching the wind itself. "How long's it been?" Sadie called, her voice trembling with awe or fear, or maybe both. Boon glanced at the sun, but knew it didn't matter. Minutes, hours, time meant nothing here. All that mattered was the bond growing stride by stride. Steelheart moved with a confidence that built on itself, their connection deepening. Then the stallion made his choice. Without warning or flair, he shifted into a trot, not rough bone-rattling, but smooth, deliberate, purposeful. Boon felt the rhythm change, felt the lift of something close to flight. He didn't fight it. He flowed with it. "That's it," he whispered. "Show me." Steelheart surged into a canter, and it was like riding a storm cloud. Each stride ate up the earth fluid and fierce. The fence rails blurred faces at the edge wide-eyed, but Boon didn't care. What mattered was the conversation, his weight, Steelheart's response, the unspoken dialogue flowing like current in a copper wire. A shift left, and Steelheart banked as clean as a hawk on the wind. A loosened rein, and the stallion stretched out, running with joy like he'd been waiting years for permission. They weren't horse and rider anymore. They were something new, born in that instant trust, given shape and breath. The answer to a question neither had known how to ask until they found each other. Time stretched like honey in the sun. Boon lost himself in the rhythm, their breaths rising and falling as one. Steelheart's ears pricked forward in a picture of pure, unshackled joy. This wasn't dominance. It wasn't surrender. It was two souls recognizing kinship and choosing to run together. 10 minutes. Sadie McCoy's voice cut through the rush of hooves and wind, though to Boon Laramie it might as well have come from another world. He heard her words, but they meant nothing. He was too deep in the silent conversation with Steelheart to remember this had started as a challenge with rules clocks and prize money. But Steelheart remembered. The stallion eased his pace, not from fatigue, but with the steady control of something that understood the line between freedom and frenzy. He slowed until they stood once more in the center of the corral. Silence fell heavy. Boon could hear his own heart, could feel the horse's breathing settle beneath him, could sense the weight of eyes watching from the rails, but none of that was real. What was real was the warmth of the animal beneath him, the trust freely given, and accepted the sure knowledge that something had shifted forever. "I'll be damned," someone whispered among the Dry Creek folks, breaking the spell. Boon slid to the ground, his legs shaky, not from fear, but from having touched something bigger than himself. Steelheart turned his head, watching Boon dismount, their eyes locking in a wordless exchange that spoke of understanding few men ever earned. 15 minutes, Sadie said clearly. "You rode him 15 minutes. Boon blinked confused, still lost inside the moment. "The challenge was 10, wasn't it?" "The challenge was not to get thrown," she corrected, stepping through the gate into the corral. "You weren't. You could have ridden him all afternoon." She stroked Steelheart's neck with a hand that trembled with relief pride, and something deeper Boon couldn't yet name. The stallion nickered softly, a sound Boon had never heard from him. He remembers Sadie whispered. He remembers what it feels like to carry someone who understands. Boon watched, seeing in that gesture the history between woman and horse, realizing this had never been about money. "Your husband," Boon said quietly. Sadie's smile was bittersweet, beautiful in its sorrow. He rode like that, like he was born for it. Like Steelheart was born to carry him. I haven't seen it since the day Hank died. The crowd drifted away, the impossible now proven. Boon barely noticed. His eyes stayed on Sadie, on the way she looked at him with recognition, gratitude, maybe something more. "The money," she said, drawing $50 in gold from her pocket. Boon glanced at it, then back at her face. It felt like a detail from another life. "Keep it," he said softly. This wasn't about that. Her brows rose. Then what was it about Boon looked at Steelheart, who stood between them like a bridge? "I think it was about finding something I didn't know I was searching for." "And what was that?" she asked. He met her eyes. Home, maybe. Or the chance of it. Sadie had been alone 3 years of running a spread on her own, making every decision, carrying every burden, fending off advice she didn't need and suitors she didn't want. She had survived, but watching Boon on her husband's horse reminded her that surviving wasn't the same as living. "You got someplace else you need to be?" she asked, casual but edged with hope. Boon looked around the fences set straight, the pastures tended, the air of purpose stitched into every part of the ranch. Then he looked back at her, seeing in her face the same steel and patience he had felt in Steelheart. "No, ma'am. Can't say I do. The Double Bar Ranch. Won't they miss you?" He thought of the lonely shack of the cattle and fences, of the endless work that filled days but never the emptiness inside. They'll find someone else. They always do. Sadie nodded, like that was what she'd expected. I could use help here. Running this place alone, it's more than one person should shoulder. The pay's fair, and there's a cabin out by the north pasture waiting for someone to live in it. She paused, watching him close. But there's one condition. What's that Steelheart comes with the job? He needs a man who understands him, someone willing to work with him instead of against him. You interested in that kind of partnership? Steelheart had stepped closer during their talk, his breath warm against Boone's shoulder. Boone felt the weight of the horse's presence steady and grounding. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice carrying a certainty he hadn't felt in years. I'd be real interested in that. Sadie's smile rose like dawn breaking warm and full of promise. Then welcome to the McCoy Ranch, Boon Laramie. I reckon this is the start of something good. As if in agreement, Steelheart lifted his head and let out a ringing whinny that echoed across the valley like a pledge of new beginnings. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire and gold mirroring the hope stirring in Boone's chest. He had come looking for a trial and found something greater, a place where he was needed, a bond worth keeping, and a future brighter than he had ever dared imagine. Most of all, he had found what every real cowboy longs for, whether he admits it or not. He had found home. The seasons rolled by like pages turning in a Bible left open on the table, each one carrying changes deeper than weather or chores. By the time spring came back to Dry Creek Valley, Boon Laramie was as much a part of the McCoy Ranch as the cottonwoods by the creek, or the morning fog that clung to the pastures. He'd taken up residence in the cabin by the north pasture, a stout little place that had sat empty too long but welcomed him as if it had been waiting. Its windows faced the sunrise, and from his porch Boone could see Steelheart grazing in the meadow, his black coat glistening like wet obsidian in the first light. The work suited Boone in ways he hadn't imagined, not just the steady rhythm of fence, mending branding and tending stock, but the partnership that had grown between him and the Stallion, that had rewritten his life. Steelheart had become more than a mount, more than muscle and hooves. He'd become a living extension of Boone's own thoughts, carrying him across range and ridge with a trust born only from scars and patience. Sadie McCoy had watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, like a woman who had planted in good soil and seen it flourish beyond her hopes. She'd watched Boone change, too, the emptiness in his eyes giving way to something almost like joy, something she hadn't thought she'd see again. But it wasn't just work that told the story. It was the in-between times, the coffee shared on her porch after the chores, the talks that started with cattle and weather, but wandered into dreams, regrets, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might look different than yesterday. One evening, as the sun bled copper and gold across the horizon, Sadie spoke. You know, I never really thanked you. Boone looked up from his cup, puzzled. For what? For proving me right, she smiled, soft and genuine. For 3 years, I swore Steelheart wasn't unrideable, just waiting for the right man who could see past the stories to the truth. Folks thought I was fooling myself, holding on to something already lost. But now they know better. Now they see. Her eyes drifted toward the pasture where the Stallion stood outlined against the fading sky. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones worth waiting for. Her voice carried a weight that spoke of more than horses. Boone's heart skipped, recognizing what she was really saying. He set his cup down. Sadie, there's something I need you to know. She turned to him, steady, patient, giving him space to find words long buried. I came here thinking I was just chasing a challenge. Thought maybe I could prove myself against a wild horse. But what I found..." He paused, searching. "What I found was a place where I could remember who I was before the war, before the ghosts, before I started running from myself." Sadie reached across the space and took his hand, her touch warm and steady, sure as bedrock. "You found yourself," she said. "Same as Steelheart did when you showed him what partnership means." Boone's voice roughened with emotion. "I found more than that. I found you." The kiss that followed was as certain as sunrise, gentle as spring rain, filled with promise that broken things could mend stronger than before. When they finally drew apart, the stars had pricked through the velvet sky, and somewhere in the distance, Steelheart let out a low call, as if blessing what had begun. "Marry me," Boone said suddenly. The words pulled from someplace deeper than thought. "I know it's fast, and I don't have much beyond a cowboy's wages and a heart that finally remembered how to hope." Sadie silenced him with another kiss, fierce and joyful. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, Boon Laramie. Yes to all of it." They wed 6 months later, on an October morning when cottonwoods blazed gold and the air carried winter's promise. The ceremony was simple, held in the ranch house parlor, with neighbors gathered close and a preacher riding out from town. Sadie wore her mother's dress, ivory silk, touched with pearls from her grandmother. Boone had bought a new shirt, pressed his best trousers, and polished his boots till they shone like mirrors. But it was Steelheart who gave the moment its soul. As Boone and Sadie spoke their vows on the porch, the Stallion came to the fence, head high, watching. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Steelheart reared once, striking the sky, a joyful salute that made the neighbors cheer and Sadie cry into her new husband's shoulder. The years that followed weren't marked by grand spectacle, but by quiet contentment. Boone proved himself not only a steady hand, but a natural leader, slowly taking on more of the ranch as Sadie's trust in him deepened. Together, they built something solid, something lasting. Together, they grew the McCoy Ranch wider and stronger, fencing new pastures, starting a breeding line that soon earned a reputation far beyond Dry Creek Valley. Steelheart became the foundation sire, stamping his foals with speedbone and spirit. But more than that, with his uncanny mind and gift for bonding with the right hands. Boon Laramie worked each young horse himself with the same patience and respect that had once won Steelheart's trust. Before long, riders across the territory spoke of the McCoy stock as horses with heart loyal as kin and quick as the wind. Yet the truest measure of what Boone and Sadie McCoy had built came 5 years into their marriage. A dust-weary rider appeared one evening, leading a limping bay and wearing desperation in every line of his frame. "Name's Tom Bradley," he said, hope flickering behind tired eyes. "Heard tell you've got folks here who understand horses better than they do people." Boone and Sadie traded a look, 5 years of shared knowing passing between them, remembering another hollow-eyed cowboy who had once ridden into their lives chasing something nameless. Sadie's smile carried the warmth of lessons hard-earned. "Well, Tom Bradley," she said gently, "I reckon you might have found exactly what you've been searching for." That night, as the sun dropped behind the mesas, painting the valley in fire and gold, Boone stood on the porch with his wife at his side and watched another story take root. Out in the pasture, Steelheart raised his head and let out a ringing call, a sound that seemed to say some trials weren't sent to break a man, but to shape him anew. In the Wild West, folks liked to say only the strongest survived, but Boon Laramie had learned a different truth, one written in the quiet language of trust, of partnership, and of love that lasts. Sometimes it wasn't about being the toughest or the boldest. Sometimes it was simply about being true. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.